At last, we come to part 5 of Finding D&D, titled, well, that's a good question. I suppose I could call it Being and Nothingness, but that seems to be taken. I'll come up with something. Fair to ask, what on earth do I mean by religion or folk religion throughout this entire series of videos? Certainly, ritual and social identity have played a major role, but it's not limited to that. And I'm also not going to turn to wholly internal and ineffable and unidentifiable, unobservable features like faith or belief and things like that. Instead, I'm going to talk about convictions which are evident through action. In particular, the notion that there is an it, that there is an external phenomenon, and not only does it exist, but it renders your existence, perhaps the existence of more than yourself, but certainly your existence, into a story. Perhaps a script, perhaps an improv, but a story. And you and people you care about have named roles. The notion that you matter in this, that this thing's existence either makes the story for you or that what you are doing is facilitating its further existence, I don't care, but something of that nature. This conviction is evident through action, in particular thinking that it would be useful and important to other people if they would only tap into this as well and have it affect their actions and their interactions the way that it is affecting you. So that's what I mean in many ways about religion, folk religion as a personal phenomenon, but it really does take on much more power and relevance as these rituals and social identities in that light. With any luck, that explains what I'm after. Perhaps as an irrelevant aside, think of it as the difference between being an evolutionary biologist and believing in evolution. The latter implies to most people who say that some kind of relevance to their life, that they should change the way they act, change any number of things because of it, that they have a role in it, they have a goal in it, there is a place for them, there is a purpose for them, things like that, that the phrase believe in carries with it almost automatically. So perhaps that comparison helps. Anyway, to carry on with role-playing, our actual topic, specifically Dungeons and Dragons as a folk religion. After these series of videos where I have presented my outlook on the matter, where does that leave us? One may well ask, well, where are you in this, Now that you've either held up a mirror to me or perhaps made comments or judgments about a number of other people, come on, cough it up. Where do you stand? And what's the point anyway? Why have you subjected us to this peroration of names, faces, history, and terms and made us sit through all this lecture? Well, let's see if I can make any sense. Consider the slipperiness among three things. Let's say the first thing is fictional content, what we actually imagine characters to be doing in situations. Whatever it is that you associate with Dungeons and Dragons as a very important piece of role-playing. What does the fictional content look like? When you look at a picture and you say, those characters are D&D characters. That's a Dungeons and Dragons thing to do. Keep that in mind. Now, think with me for a moment. Can you have that fictional content while using some game that is not designated or published as Dungeons and Dragons? And if it's important to you, you can even put that little add-on and say, does it matter more or less, or what is the relevance too, not only of calling it Dungeons and Dragons, but really tightly IP Dungeons and Dragons under the, imprimatur of TSR. Okay, so that's one thing. Let's just talk about that fictional content and realize that we can kind of decouple it from those other things. Now, let's hop to a completely different variable. In this case, the goals and the fun of play. There have been many different identifiable specific goals of play of any number of thousands and thousands of tables of people playing Dungeons and Dragons, but I'm going to speak at a relatively general level. We can talk about a competitive, and we can talk about a somewhat point scorey, better than you, did worse than you this time. I'm going to take this risk and see how it goes. And I gambled and I failed that time. Very much in the sense of sportive challenge. You can talk about that as the goals and the fun of play. You can also talk about goals of play in terms of experiencing a grand saga, in the case of at least a few people at the tables, of delivering that grand saga very much as a transitive performance from the deliverer to the audience. You can also talk about goals and fun of play as emergent from play in terms of plot. You could not get a plot without the play, and seeing what different people did with their different options at time without a prearranged or preconceived notion of what would be good. Those things are all different sorts of goals and fun of play, and for purposes of argument, I see no reason to associate one of them with Dungeons and Dragons as its goal. But that is something I think is done almost habitually, for somebody to associate that particular kind of fun with Dungeons and Dragons as such in their concept of what it must be or should be properly. So fine. Now that I've gone into that in that detail, here's my point. Take that goal and fun of play and say, can you have that goal and fun of play when it is neither with that particular fictional content that you think of as Dungeons and Dragons? Also, could you do it with similar fictional content and it not be the IP, the logo, the book, Dungeons and Dragons? I hope you can see that those are separable as well. That the specific fictional content of whatever it is you visualize that Dungeons and Dragons characters do, and the goals and fun of play of the role-playing experience in and of itself, and the actual use of products that are labeled Dungeons and Dragons, on the broad sense perhaps, Dungeons and Dragons compatible or OGL or something like that, or just, one legal step away from corresponding with, to the very strict sense of this is published by the proper people with the proper legalities and the proper label. Either way, we've got fictional content, fun and goals of play, and ownership and IP. Let's recognize that they can be decoupled. That they don't, something can be published by DnD and called Dungeons and Dragons, and you say, that's not it. Something can be the right kind of fun and goal and play that you've been getting out of that, and you're like, wow, that was fun. I had fun playing that thing, which happens to be neither that particular fictional content and not that particular IP. And finally, that you could be looking at this kind of fictional content and it can be separable from those other things as well. So that's step one, to kind of get an idea of where I'm coming from with this. Step two, and related, is to recognize just how crazy diverse the catalog is. Even in the D&D tent, if you want to look at it that way, what are all these things in here? And even if we look at the strictest sense, something called Dungeons and Dragons as published by a company with the name or the imprint within it of TSR, we're talking about 9 things by a bunch of different people, published in a wide variety of different economic circumstances and distribution methods. Just not imaginably, in many cases, the same thing, or at least not by me. If you expand outward to compatibility and OGL and that form of imitation or correspondence, which is, as I say, one kind of legal stroke of the pen away from being able to do it at all, if you look across that, then the number of titles, I mean, even the number of categories expands, as far as I'm concerned, to at least 14 or 15, and the literal number of titles is, you got to bring a couple of baskets to carry all of those. So we are really talking about a lot of different stuff to call a thing. And the experiential knowledge that it would take to decide whether they represent some kind of vector, some thing, some spirit, some essence, or some particular way that some correspond to better than others, things like that. Well, good luck. I think that would be beyond the personal experience of even the most widely experienced role players around, unless you or I dedicated a considerable amount of time and a considerable amount of reflection to trying to catalog that. And even then, somebody else could look at me and say, you weren't looking at it right. So that's step 2, understanding the diversity of the available material. Let's pause for a moment with step 1s and step 2s and that definition that I gave under our belts and ask. Look at the notion of kind of a profile of your own of what kind of fiction and what kind of fun and what degree of officiality you want. And then we look at that spray of available material, and who knows, maybe you can even see one or more than one of the publications, or perhaps, some strain of mutated version of it that you've arrived at that's just right. And here's my question for you. In terms of plain and simple role-playing enjoyment, performing the activity with other people, why isn't that good enough? What is it that is gained? What is it that is sought? What is it that is conceived of that it that is important in such a fashion that it creates convictions and behaviors based on those convictions? The need for others to get it, the need for others to see it, the need for you to be loyal to it. What makes it a way to play about some stuff, potentially published in a particular fashion, that's fun for you? What makes it anything except those things? What in the, I think, very arguable presence of a folk religious determination, what do you get out of it? What's being sought? Let's say it's found. It's coming one day. Well, guess what? It came. It's back there in the mists of history. Well, guess what? You found the right text and the right letter from Dave Arneson to Gary Gygax, or the right, notes from somebody's desk, or whatever it took. Read that publication, put those notes together, read that letter, and say, I got it, we found it. Or perhaps you have arrived at it yourself. You have taken a look through the different ways to play that you've encountered, and you've picked a little of that and you've put it into play, and you are like, whoa, I got it. You know what? I'm even going to publish it. Got it on the OGL this way. Got it. Let's say you have it. Now what do you get that's more than or more important than the fact that you few other gamers can be enjoying yourself at the table, and if you want, which I fully understand, the desire to share that with others in the form of publication for them as will enjoy it too. Period. What else? What's being sought? It's exactly the same question that one can ask about finding Jesus. Well, what do you get? What happens? You got him. Okay, maybe you found him in your heart. Maybe, you figured him out through biblical scholarship and you're determined, we found the guy, we found the grave, we found the document, we found the whatever. Or perhaps you are, the rapture happens or whatever, you turn around and hey, here he is, returned. What happens in the story then? In that big story? You found D&D. Let's say you did. For some reason, oddly enough, people never seem to. The next edition, not quite. Maybe for now, in the first flush of purchase, this particular modification, not quite. That guy does his OGL, well, not quite, whatever. What happens then? And I have not heard or experienced or seen or observed or encountered anybody who really can say, is it going to make you happy? Is it going to make you immortal? Is it going to solve particular logistic problems? What's going on? That's not simply, in the case of role-playing, enjoying yourself with some people and sharing how you did it with some other people. Why isn't enjoying the right kind of game for the kind of fun you want about the fictional material that you like enough? Let's say it is enough. Let's say all of a sudden you don't have to protect D&D. That if it, as publication, for example, it ceased to be published. That's it, 5th edition, all done. No more D&D published. Maybe just adventures for it, OGL stuff, whatever. But, no, there isn't going to be another D&D. Everything shuts down. Poof. Not going to happen. Is that bad? That the hobby continues with other games being published and this one being a prominent, perhaps noble, contribution to its history, or an ignoble one? I don't care. But is it a disaster for the hobby? A disaster for you? Is there some reason why that would matter? And similarly, does it have to be protected from defamation? Someone says, D&D sucks. What happens if you don't say anything? What happens if you don't tweet back? What happens, maybe somebody will believe them. So, these are the questions that are worth asking of oneself, and to discern whether these are truly a problem in regard to the relationship of humans to the world or the reality around us, or whether you just feel attacked by this person who never met you and is using buzzwords sprayed into the internet. So, I leave that to you. Think perhaps of being able to talk about playing different kinds of D&D, whether different publishers, different writers, different times, or other games, that are like it. Think of being able to play any of those or your versions of it with no context of where it stands in terms of value at that level. You can talk about where it stands in terms of history, in terms of effects. That's a very interesting, discussion. You could also think about where it stands in terms of your enjoyment and why, a matter of reflection on why and how I play, why and how you play, which is also of great value, but not in terms of that larger story and status within it, who is closer to the main veins of that story, who has a stronger role in it or sees the story properly so that their role in it is of more weight than someone else's. This person says, hey, I'm playing BX, and we're doing this and that and the other person says, whoa, we're playing 5th edition over here, and you know what, we totally threw out those inspiration rules, but we came up with this other kind of weird mechanic. It's even better than experience and inspiration put together. Who knew? And guess what? You could be talking the same way about various other role-playing games, and there, it's not a big deal. Why is it a big deal here? Imagine the freedom of just being able to enjoy this D&D and have someone else appreciate your enjoyment of it without it being a big deal that this person is playing 4th edition and this person is playing Advanced Dungeons & Dragons 2nd edition or whatever. How could that be? What's lost by doing it? Back to those 1800s, which I just, it's like sticky tar. I just can't seem to step my way out of those. And we look at the prominent personage of Thomas Henry Huxley. And here we have a person who, one of my favorite people in history, so I'm just biting my tongue about all the things to say, but in many ways in a very unusual position, being in the Royal College of Surgeons and very close to British policy regarding science and education in all sorts of ways, out of class, in sort of the wrong social class to have come from that, out of age range, having come to it extremely young, and in many ways in a very powerful but also very alienated position. Well, let's take a look at Thomas Henry Huxley when he is on committees that are literally supposed to figure out how evolutionary biology and other aspects of swiftly developing modern science are supposed to be relating to society and to religion. He's actually on committees for this. And he came up with a word that really described an outlook of saying, I don't care. I don't care. I don't care about the God part, and I don't care whether there is one. It's not that I'm insisting there isn't. It doesn't matter, because whatever is the case regarding any such thing, it doesn't seem to affect what we actually came here to concern ourselves with, today. What our problem, our thing to do, the decision I have to make tomorrow morning. All these things are just not affected by knowledge, certainty, and some sort of weird interaction with reality of that stuff. So, who cares? This outlook is incomprehensible to someone who is dedicated to such a topic, and that dedication can come all the way from fervent establishmentarian faith, devotion, doctrinaire authoritarianism, the whole thing, all the way to rejection, flat out rejection. That's not the way it is. Not the way it is. Nope. No such thing. And I'll tell you why there's no such thing, and I will insist upon and reason upon and slam my fist on the table about no such thing. And for some reason I can't seem to shut up about that thing either. Both of those and anything in the spectrum between them takes a look at what Huxley said, and it's just flat out incomprehensible. What do you mean? You have to have an opinion. You have to have an opinion on it. You have to have a position. A person cannot not have a position because they don't care. You have to care. And Huxley, confronted with reactions of this kind, says, well, I need a word. I need a word. The trouble is that word has been twisted in the intervening century and a half, and I'm afraid to say it. The word was agnostic. All right, I know what you're thinking. Agnostic means sitting on the fence, right? Agnostic says, well, this may be right and that may be right, and well, I'm going to kind of try and split the difference, and I'm going to try and get along, and thinking that none of the really bad stuff that these guys claim could be, the case. So kind of picking the good from the God side, and those guys are so negative and mean. Why don't we just those atheist people? So we're just gonna be we're gonna get along and say this how they may be right, but I'm gonna try and go with as much as the religious stuff as I can. So this wishy-washy crap. That's not what agnostic meant to Huxley when he coined the term. Today, all of the different parsing of terminology, at least most recently, has landed his outlook with the term hard agnosticism, which I suppose is true in a scholarly sense. It's not as though anybody walking around on the street ever heard the term or quite knows what it means, but the notion being that it's just not the problem at hand. And that's where I stand. I would love to play a role-playing game with you. There are hundreds. I have played so many and enjoyed so many. Many of them alike, many of them different. Many of them named Dungeons & Dragons, many of them not. Under the position of hard agnosticism regarding Dungeons & Dragons as a religion, all of a sudden what you have added to the library of role-playing games a ton more titles. You simply have more games to try, to adapt, if you will, to various tweaky things you want to do, or not, if you're into the sort of historical, how did it work frame of mind, whichever. And that's more games for me. And I'll play with you. Get in touch. I'm in no hurry. Take off the glowy hat. Lose the notion of the story that DnD tells us that you're a part of because you, draw yourself up, play D&D. No need for that. Down here with the sinners, there's plenty of fun to be had.